everybody, my name is Robin and I'm one of the talking heads behind NZPocketGuide.com, New Zealand's largest travel guide. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently and we're going to cover two pieces of news that we received this week and that can help us forecast and foresee what New Zealand travel may look like in the future. The first news has to do with the Managed Isolation Quarantine or MIQ, and the second news has to do with the certification of other vaccine than the Pfizer vaccine currently available in New Zealand. So let's get started with the new MIQ rules. I'm going to break those ones down into three different steps because that's kind of like what the timeline that the Ministry of Health of New Zealand has announced, and we're going to cover all of them one by one. So let's start with step number one. We should kick into action around the 8th of November 2021. So this pertains to a reopening of the borders for low-risk travelers, allowing them to bypass MIQ. This is for travelers from the Pacific Island nations such as Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu and Tokelau. The existing arrangement for free travel between the Cook Islands and Niue and New Zealand will not change and remain as they are right now. So although that doesn't pertain to a lot of different countries, this is already a sign that the New Zealand government is willing to work with countries that have done an extremely good job with managing the outbreak of COVID-19. And all of the countries that I have just listed right now have had little to no cases of COVID-19 and therefore are going to be safe travel arrangements between New Zealand and their own country. So that doesn't mean that New Zealanders can take holidays to go there and then come back easily and everything like that. There's going to be still some few things to work into play, and it's mostly for inbound travels, but that's a sign that the New Zealand government is willing to reward countries which are doing a good job with COVID-19 with free travel arrangements. The next step of MIQ MIQ revisited right here is going to get started around the 14th of November 2021, and this will pertain to reducing the amount of time spent in MIQ or Managed Isolation Quarantine from 14 days to 7 days. So the arrivals will be tested on day 0, day 3, day 6, and then they will undertake a rapid antigen test before leaving MIQ. Then they will isolate at home for 3 days and then get a PCR test, stay at home while waiting for the result, and then be allowed into the community. So this also means that because the stay in MIQ will be reduced by half, the fee for staying in MIQ will also be reduced by half. So currently for one adult alone staying in MIQ, it costs about 3,100 New Zealand dollars. So this will reduce the fee into about 1,550, which is much more manageable. This also means that you do need to have a home or a dwelling in order to be able to stay and do the rest of your isolation. So that mostly only applies to people which are already residents in New Zealand. The next step is that is going to get started from the first quarter of 2022, which is January, February or March. And that's traveler arriving will move toward home isolation rather than MIQ. So this will happen once New Zealand has safely transitioned to the new traffic light system. So this new traffic light system has been outlined by the New Zealand government many times, and we talked about it quite a lot during our live session. But basically there's 3 steps: the green step, orange step and the red steps, and this will depend what is how bad is the outbreak in New Zealand. And this will kick into gear once New Zealand hits the 90% vaccination rate. That is the target for the New Zealand government. The amount of time that people are going to have to spend in home isolation will depend on a lot of different factors, and that's not been announced right now. So all of those changes right now don't really apply to anyone who just have a tourist visa or a basic work visa that want to come and work in New Zealand. They mostly apply to people which are resident in New Zealand or are in very critical shortage skill list and all these kind of things. So although that may not apply to you right here, right now, it may just show you what kind of steps the New Zealand government is currently taking into getting more people into the country and what it may look like in the future for new visa holders coming into into New Zealand. So that's why we thought we could outline this one here and show you what are the steps that's going to be taken. Also, this really tells us that the New Zealand borders are not going to be reopened until, well, at least past March 2022, since this plan is already covering all the way to March 2022. And then after that, they will have to start working on the plan and progressively roll it out. So it will take quite a while, and that also means that the New Zealand borders may not be reopening until at least the second half of 2022, if not later. All right, let's move on to this vaccination news that we also received. And that pertains to vaccination received overseas by border workers, which is now recognized by the New Zealand government. So let's go over some piece of information that we received from Radio New Zealand. So the New Zealand government has announced 3 COVID-19 vaccines commonly administered overseas that are now recognized under the vaccination order that requires people working at New Zealand's borders to be fully vaccinated. So the reason why we're looking at this is because it is one of the first vaccine orders which actually require and mandates people to be vaccinated. So therefore that requires the New Zealand government to actually write a list of which vaccine they recognize, which they have not done so since the only vaccine available in New Zealand was the Pfizer vaccine. So it follows the changes to the legislation in response to the need to recognize other vaccines beyond the Pfizer vaccine, which was the only vaccines for COVID-19 available in New Zealand. This move is done by the Ministry of Health in order to help employers and keep the community safe. So, to meet the requirements of the amended vaccination order, a border worker who has received a single dose of the 2-dose Pfizer, Moderna vaccines or AstraZeneca, those names, while overseas will need to have a further dose of the Pfizer vaccines, and workers which have completed the Janssen vaccines will be allowed to be able to work at the border. So this means that basically the New Zealand government has already recognized the legality of the Moderna, the AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccine, plus obviously the Pfizer vaccines. So if you overseas have already received those vaccines, well, there is some sign that this may be some of the earliest vaccine recognized by the New Zealand government. Obviously, so far that news only apply for people working at the border, because there is a lot of effort in getting a lot of people working at the border and working in all those managed isolation quarantine facilities and all those kind of very critical positions, and it is a very manpower intensive kind of effort, and therefore they're hiring a lot of people and they need to be a little bit flexible in which vaccine they accept. But that also tells us that since those vaccines have been recognized for that purpose, maybe as a traveler those 3 vaccines may also be recognized by New Zealand, which therefore makes it 4 different vaccines that you may be able to use to come to New Zealand, maybe later on as a tourist if vaccination for COVID-19 becomes mandatory for visiting New Zealand. So I thought that those news were important to kind of put in there, and I thought that it's also quite important to just finish by telling you that pretty much none of those news apply to people looking into taking a holiday to New Zealand or having a basic work visa and trying to make their way to New Zealand. Those news very much only applies to residents, people which are on the critical shortage skill list, and people which are working at the border. But they are just kind of early signs of what we may expect for the broader masses when the New Zealand border reopened. So I hope that you did find this video useful and that it gave you a little bit of context into those latest news that I've seen a lot of chatters on social media about, and maybe a lot of misinformation. If you find this video useful, maybe share it with a few of your friends. It would be really nice for us to get a little bit more exposure. And obviously like and subscribe. It's always a free way to reward all our hard work and make sure that you are informed with our next video. And join us for one of our next live sessions. It's at 8 AM New Zealand time every single Sunday. Alright, you stay safe out there. Bye bye, see you on the next video.